So with that, let's get started. Welcome to the Entwine Exclusive. My name is Ariel, and I am the Senior Engagement Manager at JDC Entwine. I am thrilled to see so many new people on the exclusive this week. So for those of you who might not know us yet, Entwine is the young adult platform of the Joint Distribution Committee, or JDC, the world's leading Jewish humanitarian organization, operating in over 70 countries worldwide. We started the Entwine Exclusive back in March as an opportunity to give you, our audience, a behind-the-scenes look at how JDC and our partners and our alumni are responding to current events and taking action in their local communities. And at the end of the day, we really just want to connect you to the global Jewish world. So a few housekeeping tips before we dive in. Shauna Delinka is on here monitoring our Q&A and chat. Feel free to post questions for our panelists throughout, and we'll do our best to get to some of them at the end. She will also be sharing some articles so you can learn more about our topic after the session. We'll be including all of these links and more in a follow-up email as well. Today, we're excited to explore and learn about the Jewish community of Dubai, the fastest growing city in the world and the most populous city in the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has been in the news a lot recently because of the normalization agreement with Israel called the Abrahamic Accord that was signed just last week, the original date of this exclusive. So thank you all for your flexibility as we had to reschedule. I do want to note that JDC is a non-political organization, so we're not going to touch on the politics of the agreement itself, but rather we'll be learning about the first community to be created in the Muslim world in 700 years. But don't worry, we'll get to hear a bit about how the community has been impacted by the current events and by the signing of the accord. So I'm going to turn it over now to Sean Hoffman, the Deputy Director of Entwine, who is going to moderate our conversation today. Sean.
Thanks, Ariel, and hi, everyone. As Ariel shared, my name is Sean Hoffman. I'm Entwine's Deputy Director, and I'm really glad for the opportunity to be facilitating this conversation during what is, of course, both challenging and, as we're about to see, a really exciting time. In early 2019, the Jewish community of Dubai reached out to JDC through a few different channels, and the two organizations, the two entities, began to build a relationship. For JDC, this was really about beginning to understand what the needs of the Jews of Dubai were, and then by thinking up the ways in which some support could be provided. To me, one of the most remarkable things about the Jewish community in the UAE is that they built something really impressive without a single paid staff person. Everyone in the community at this point is a volunteer. And so with that, one of the ways that JDC found that we could best support the community was by offering some staff capacity at a really crucial time. And so we took the step of placing our 2019 Ralph I. Goldman Fellow, Jessica Katz, who we're fortunate to have joining us today, with the community in Dubai for a number of months at the end of 2019. In February of this year, of 2020, right before the world sort of went into lockdown, I visited the Jewish community in Dubai myself, and I actually remember traveling with my trusty KN95 mask, even though people weren't quite yet wearing them in most places yet. And since then, it's really been a privilege to be a part of the blossoming relationship between JDC and the Jewish Council of the Emirates, and a privilege to host Jessica and Ross Creel, who is the president of the Jewish Council of the Emirates, with us today. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists, Jessica and Ross, to take just 1 minute and introduce yourselves quickly before we get into the heart of the conversation. So Ross, do you want to take a minute and just share a bit about your background and history in the community?
Sure. So thanks, Sean, for the introduction. It was great seeing you here in Dubai in February, and great to be on this Entwine Exclusive. Ross Creel, as you mentioned, is my name. I've been coming to Dubai since 2008, a long time, but I moved here with my family in 2013, with my wife and children. And I took a leadership role fairly early on that has now been formalized in my position as president. I originate from Johannesburg. I'm an observant Jew, which was quite fundamental to my story as well. And it's been really, really amazing for me to call the UAE my home, which is what I now do.
Great, thank you. And Jess, do you want to take a minute and just share a bit of your story and how you came to be serving in Dubai?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for having me. It's so exciting to be back in JDC Entwine world. As Sean mentioned, I was the 2019 Ralph I. Goldman Fellow with JDC Entwine, which meant that I had this incredible opportunity to travel what ended up being all over the world last year, in addition to Dubai. My background is I'm originally from Detroit. My background is in HR, and I've worked for a number of nonprofit organizations. And prior to the fall of last year, when I arrived in Dubai, I had spent my time as a fellow really traveling into 11 different countries. I had spent almost every Shabbat, if I count it that way, in a different place. And Dubai was the place that I spent the longest. So I spent about 3 months. I arrived in September. Actually, just a few weeks ago, it was a year since I'd been there, and so much has changed in a year. But I really, throughout the year, and I always say this, that a lot of my travels prior to getting to Dubai, I think helped inform my experience in working with the community there, which we can get into in a little bit, but in the diversity of who is the community, and just being able to learn about what the global Jewish community looks like before I got to Dubai.
Well, thanks, Jess. So while the UAE has been in the news quite a bit lately, I appreciate that many people may not even know exactly where it is and what some of the significance around that is. So Ariella is going to put some maps up on the screen. And Jess, I'm wondering if you could give us some of the geographic context.
Sure. So actually, when Sean called and asked me about if I would be even interested in going to Dubai, I will admit that I did then go to my computer and open up a map to figure out where in the world actually is the UAE and Dubai. In my head, I've always heard of it. But I figured it was worthwhile to just note, like, where is this place? We talk about the Gulf sometimes, and just being able to kind of see, as Ariel sort of highlighted, where when we talk about the UAE, and then in the UAE, there's Dubai. Abu Dhabi is also worth mentioning, just because it's about 90 minutes or an hour, 90 minutes from Dubai, and it's the capital of the UAE. And there's a lot that's been going on there as well, that you may have heard. As well as we get into, the exciting news, I'll say this, I know Ross will follow up with it. One of the exciting things about relations to Israel is being able to travel directly from Israel to the UAE. And you can kind of see how far it is. Like, it's really not so far if you take a direct path. Myself, when I flew, and I know this has been for many people in the community for so many years, I did fly from Israel, but I had to go through Turkey with a long layover in order to actually get to Dubai. And up until that point, there's been that way of getting there, as well as through, yes, a very long flight from Turkey, as well as I know some people have been able to go through Jordan as well. But up till this point, it definitely takes quite a lot longer than it really should. To give some other background, I think that's the next slide, Ariel. The UAE, as you can see, is made up of a number of emirates, and Dubai is one of those emirates. Abu Dhabi is another one. There's seven, eight, Ross, and other emirates that make up the whole of the UAE. And then the last map was just a quick overview of Dubai and kind of what it looks like. A lot of people may have heard of the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, which you can always see when looking at Dubai. A lot of people also know about the Palm, which there's also pictures here, and you can really physically see these man-made islands where a lot of exciting activity happens. It's a really interesting land. You know, for me, arriving, you really are landing in the middle of the desert, and then suddenly there's these big, tall buildings, beautiful history, tons of beautiful architecture. It's a really cool looking city. Even this picture you guys have found, it really is, it's desert and city sort of mixed together really nicely.
Cool. Thank you, Jess. Ross, turning to you, can you tell us just a little bit about the Jewish community? Who are you and they? You know, what are some of the local customs or people? You know, what are the levels of religious observance? Tell us a bit about yourselves.
Sure. So the community in its current form started in about 2010. So what you see now is the outcome of 10 years of community development. We certainly were, because I think in a certain sense it's changed now, we were a group of expat Jews from every part of the world. Dubai is mostly made up of expats. What's interesting is that there's only 1 million Emiratis in a population of about 11 million people. So most of those expats, by the way, are from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. But there's also a large group of Western expats that the Jews are part of, and they come from every country in the world. And I think what's beautiful about our community is how diverse it is. Every language is spoken: Portuguese, Yiddish, German, Spanish, obviously English, Arabic, French. So very, very diverse community. Originally, sort of 20 Sunnings, generally not married, wanting to boost their career. And over time, our community has, as it's grown and become more mature, we've had more families, we've had more children. So the demographic of the community has shifted in quite important ways over the 10 years that we've been here. The people here have a very, very beautiful, strong Jewish identity, strong enough to reveal their Jewish identity, at least to other community members, and form a community in quite difficult circumstances in the beginning. But they are not necessarily religious. So for a long time, my family was the only religious family, not just in the suburb or the city, but in the region. And that was quite an interesting experience for my wife and I. But even though people are not religious, they wanted to come to our community. They wanted to come to our famous communal villa, which Sean and Jessica have both visited, and Jessica knows it very well. She stayed there during her fellowship. But that was the one place where you could really be Jewish. And the result is that everybody came. And that was wonderful because it created a real atmosphere of camaraderie. When you met somebody that was Jewish, you didn't ask them, you know, whether they were conservative or reform or whatever. That wasn't important. The fact that they were Jewish and identifying as such was all you needed to know. And it created a beautiful ethos of camaraderie, a beautiful sense of Ahavat Yisrael, of love of your fellow Jew. It was very, very beautiful and empowering for the community. And the other thing that I'll mention, Sean mentioned that we're all volunteers, which is one feature of our community. The other feature of our community is that we've been mostly community-led, spiritually as well, which has been quite empowering as well. And I think that the result of that has been a version of Judaism which is alive, elemental, and something that we all felt that we owned in quite a fundamental way. These are all values that we want to hold on to. They define who we are as a community.
Thanks, Ross. Jess, reflections from you on the community, having entered it not as perhaps a community member, but as someone from the outside?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, this was, you know, I had been all over the world in some cases, visiting many, many Jewish communities, and walking into the Dubai community in the villa that I was living in that also served as sort of the community center. It was one of the most welcoming communities that I visited. I think, you know, the people, and maybe it's a function of being expats to some extent, and I also just think it's a function of, you know, finding that, as Ross mentioned, the cohesiveness of the community. really people who are just looking to connect with one another within their Jewish identity. And, you know, coming to a Shabbat service and sitting around the lunch table, you have people from all over the world, and different backgrounds and different Jewish backgrounds and different Jewish identities and thoughts about all of that, in addition to visitors and people who were visiting the community. That to me, it was, from even the first week, I felt like I was still a part of it, and people greeted and took care of me in this way that was just so beautiful. And I think that it still is a part of, you know, the what the Dubai community is. So yeah, I think it was, for me, a really nice way. It was a community I was spending a lot of time in, and I really jumped in, given that I arrived and a few weeks later were the high holidays last year. And, you know, I wrote something about this. I think I was a little nervous. I was away from home. I hadn't been home all year, and it still felt, those 3 weeks later, like, okay, I've got family and community around me, which I think is a testament to just who the community is, and how much they look and take care of people who kind of show up. Because I also think it's a community that's making sure that there's kosher food and making sure that there's Jewish experiences for visitors who are coming. You know, there are a lot of people doing business in Dubai. And so I think that that's another piece of what this community is.
Wonderful. Thank you. And interesting reflections hearing from the inside or outside perspectives. Ross, one of the most, and perhaps the most unique thing about the community in the UAE is the context in which the community exists. Can you tell us a bit about what that context looks like? Maybe a bit about the relationship between the Jewish community and the rest of the Emirati population, things along those lines.
Sure. Well, the context has changed radically since last Tuesday. So I'm going to speak about the pre-Tuesday context. So the UAE it's a Muslim country. It's an Arabic country. Before the 15th of September, it had no ties whatsoever with Israel. And legislation relating to Israel that was quite prescriptive. You couldn't bring in Israeli products of any kind, and couldn't very obviously declare love of Israel, travel to Israel, things of that kind. So that was a context which is quite tough for a Jewish community. And when we began our community, one of the first things we had to work out is whether there was a place for us at all in that context. And there may not have been in our perception. In other words, when we first started, we weren't sure whether there could actually be a Jewish community at all. So that's quite a tough context in which to form a Jewish community. What's really interesting is that, in fact, the values of the UAE are very deeply sympathetic to pluralism and to communities such as ourselves. In fact, what we later realized and worked out is that Jews, Christians, and Muslims are considered in the Emirati imagination to be family members, deeply connected by our connection to Abraham. And as we learned that over time, our confidence grew, and there was a sense that there was a place for us, and we had to create the ecosystem for that. That goes back to the founder of the UAE, Sheikh Zayed, who's also the leader of Abu Dhabi. And you saw that amazing map. Jessica did a great introduction, but it's also worth mentioning that the UAE is only 49 years old. That's it was only recently formed. And that founder, Sheikh Zayed, was deeply committed to a vision of pluralism. But the challenge for us was to apply that vision to our community. We had to translate that vision. And doing that required innovation and sort of a cooperative effort between us, the UAE authorities, and several global Jewish organizations that had been working on lobbying, on creating relationships over many years. Of course, that includes the JDC, which is an invaluable support for our community, but it also includes other international Jewish organizations like Simon Wiesenthal and the AJC and the Conference of Presidents, etc. Many frankly, American Jewish organizations were very active. But all of us worked on this project, and we knew that it was possible, but the application and translation took a great deal of innovation. But our concept, our context, to summarize, at the outset seemed to be kind of difficult one in which to make a Jewish community.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense. And now that we've talked a bit about sort of the context inside the community, outside of the community, and Ross, you mentioned some of the ways you've needed to change and adapt the community over the past decade. I'm wondering if you could, if we can pause and for yourself as a founder of the community, when you look back, share with us, some of the lessons that you've learned over a decade of community building, and what those sort of mean for you now today.
Sure, I'd love to, and these are conversations Jessica and I have had very often at the Teal Cafe in Dubai, where Jess and I used to meet for a coffee in the afternoon. A couple of things, and some of these things we got right, and I think some of them we didn't get right. If I reflect, Sean, the first thing I would say is that it's really, really important to form a committee, have a constitution, have proper elected structures. That's really, really very important. It's quite tough to do, especially in the beginning, because a lot of people will think it's not important to have. And it takes a lot of effort. It took us a year to negotiate our constitution. It was a very tough process. The reason it's so important is first of all, you're going to need it at some point. At some point, a donor is going to ask you for your constitution, or a government official, or if you want to open a bank account, you'll need it. Or for some other reason, that constitution and the fact that you're officially constituted will be really, really important. And it's not something you can just do overnight. So as tough as it is, as demanding as it is, it's very, very important to create a formal structure. And I think that applies to the Jewish community anywhere in the world. Second thing, it was very important for us in this context to create relationships with the government, to make sure that we were obeying the law, to want to be fully permitted, and in no way to come across as a secret synagogue. Some of the newspapers called us a secret synagogue, and we didn't really like that at all, because vis-a-vis government, we really wanted to be very open. And when I first came, I noticed that the leaders at the time were used sort of writing coded emails, so they wouldn't write Rosh Hashanah, they would write sort of R-SH, rather than, they wouldn't write out Israel, they would write out ISR and all sorts of things. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to make it very clear to the government authorities that we were not hiding our presence in any way, and that on the contrary, we wanted to engage actively with them, be permitted, be official, and very much obey the law in every single way. That was also very important. The third thing that was important that I think we really did get right, and that I'm very proud of, is that, as I described earlier, and Jessica really experienced this, and our community is very inclusive. It embraces all the different Jewish denominations. It covers people that are religious and totally irreligious. We had people coming to our villa, communal villa, who had never been in a shul in their whole life, to people that, had payot and sort of, were wearing a top hat kind of, so wide range of Jewish denominations. And our structure, which worked really well, is that we distinguish between membership in our structures and our community, and membership in prayer services. And the way that worked out is that you could belong to the JCE, the Jewish Council of the Emirates. You could vote in its elections. You could stand for its structure. You could be the president, the secretary, the treasurer. You could be invited to all its events as a fully fledged member, regardless of your background and denomination. But then separately, where you prayed and how you prayed would be really determined by that particular prayer service, whether it's Orthodox or egalitarian or Reform or what have you. So we separated the idea of how you pray from who you are. And I think that worked really well, and that's something that we're very proud of. And again, certainly maybe not for a synagogue, but for an organization such as ours that wants to be representative, that structure worked really well. And the final thing that I want to mention as having worked really well is that we created order in the way that we did things. We created a fixed time for prayer, and we created a fixed place for prayer, and we try to do things in a very regular way. And our minyan, the Orthodox prayer service, just started with me and my dear friend Alex Petterfront, who Jessica knows very well. It was just two of us, but we pretended we were 100 people. We always started on time. We did the whole service, and we pretended we were doing it for, Entwine Exclusive. In other words, we pretended that there were 50 people with us who we really cared about. And whether it was two of us or 10 of us or 100 of us didn't make a difference. We really did the whole thing. We started promptly at 9. We went, we really kept a very regular place. And the reason that was so important is because people knew where to go. They didn't have to check the invite or make sure they got the time right or make sure they got the address right. So we created a nodal point. And in that nodal point, we started to generate heat. And that heat started to sort of warm the outer layers of our community, and people started to gravitate towards us. So that worked really well. So to summarize, 1, organization; 2, obeying the law and making sure that you are fully permitted, official, or at least aspiring to be; 3, a structure that allows you to be inclusive, but also really just be authentic; and finally, a regular place and regular times.
Thanks, Ross. And I appreciate also the really kind of structured way you laid that out for all of our community builders out there who are, I'm sure, taking notes. One really quick question, just because we're getting a few of them coming through the chat. Ross, how big is the community in the UAE?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and nobody knows the answer to that. I say hundreds. We know that when we constituted ourselves, we formally had 200 people who voted and met the requirements to be members of our community, which was an adult resident of the UAE. So that number for sure we know. We know that we are getting 180 to sort of 220, 230 people just now for Rosh Hashanah. So imagine that a lot of people, because of COVID, are not coming or out of town. And imagine there's a lot of people that still feel that they aren't ready to connect. If you double or triple that figure, you're still in the hundreds. You've seen in the press, if you've read it, that some people are saying thousands. That's our future, but I'm skeptical about that being our numbers now. But interestingly short, it hasn't really mattered. I mean, what's been fascinating is that our impact as a community, the symbolic power of our presence here, the fact that we are viable, is true of that 200 or 300 people as much as it would be true of 2,000 or 3,000 people. We've created a Jewish embassy here. That's really what we've done. Impact, I think, has been massive, out of proportion to our numbers.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I've already started to hear from a lot of people is just, the numbers may be what they may be, but the potential is huge. So thanks. I want to ask one more question, and then I want to save some time for Q&A so that the audience can ask. And I know there's a number of questions that have come through the chat already. But just to bring things back to the global picture, Jess, for you coming into the community, being on this this global fellowship, being an American living there, what were your experiences in terms of the connections between the community and the global Jewish world, and especially at a time before the relationship with Israel was as it is right now?
Right. I would say, again, last year. So one of the things last year before I went and before I was even set foot in Dubai, I did research online to figure out, where was I going? What was I looking into? And there really was nothing about the Jewish community at all. Now that's all changed. There's many, many articles out there. But really, I think globally, since I've been there, that's always the question when I would share stories about my entire year where I visited more than 12, countries and was all over the world learning about Jewish communities. Always people have the most questions about my time in Dubai because I think it's the thing that people are so unfamiliar with. The community there, I think, everybody is connected to their home country or where they're from, and what you know. I always say, like, you know what you know. So us American Jews are really lucky, and I always feel so grateful for all of the opportunities that I've had to connect with, you know, whether it's different denominations or different global organizations or local organizations. Not every country has quite as many of those. So a lot of folks coming from European countries or Australia, South Africa, some of the countries that make up a lot of the community there, their knowledge of global organizations is also not necessarily, you know, not everyone is in deep with Jewish community organizations. I'm sure some of us on this call, JDC Entwine insiders are, of course, but a lot of, even while I was there, was sharing just resources of what exists. And I think now, especially after the last few weeks, I know the community has been really well connected to a lot of different global Jewish organizations. While I was there, I can share, we launched PJ Library. And so PJ Library was sending Jewish books, which functions in a number of countries, but started sending books to the kids in Dubai. And there were, you know, I think also even with COVID, what was exciting for me being here in the States and in my apartment for a very long time in Detroit, I've been able to connect into the services every Friday. For me, it's 9 a.m. So it's a great way for me to start my day actually on every Friday when I jump into the Kabbalat Shabbat services that the Dubai community has been holding. And I think it's been a way for people who have been connected to the community and are part of the community to stay connected with one another throughout COVID. It's sort of one of those, you know, positive sides is that pre-COVID, I probably wouldn't have wouldn't have been able to tap in this way. And I know some people had, the questions around the Abrahamic house, I also talked to, but we can get into that in a minute. I think from a global perspective, it's one of the things going off of what Ross mentioned is I think any small community, coming from any small community, global communities that are really small and have only hundreds of Jewish people in them, it's a really different experience than coming from, you know, I sometimes think in Detroit where a community of 70,000 Jews, we think we're small here in America. We're not when you think of communities that have hundreds of Jews or, you know, an unknown number. And I think that power of having commitment and consistency to what Jewish is really important. And it makes it a different experience. So the fact is when someone in the community wants to have a minyan or needs to say Kaddish for a family member, the community really rallies, and there's only so many people that are going to show up, and you only have that many people to count on. And I think that it goes further. And I saw many times where people showed up to a service or showed up to the community because they know that there's not a ton of other doors to knock on in terms of finding out who else is Jewish there. And I think that's something special. And it's not, I'd say there's definitely something special about the Dubai community. I think there's also some resonance with other small communities around the world. It's sort of this small community versus larger Jewish community.
And I know there's been a couple good questions in the chat also about the relationships between the JCE and other communities in the Arab world. I want to pause for a second. I want to thank you both already immensely for your responses, and we have some really, really great questions, just as I said, that have come through. So I'm going to hand it back to Ariel to sort of lead the Q&A.
Thanks. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. But a lot of the questions are around the relationship between the Jewish community and the Muslim community and the Christian community in the UAE. Ross, could you touch a bit more on what that looks like? And can you also note the Abrahamic house? A lot of people were curious about that building in Abu Dhabi, I believe.
So I'll start with that. In fact, Jessica participated in some amazing meetings around that in the early days. So the Abrahamic Family House is an initiative of the Abu Dhabi government. It's going to be a religious complex that houses a synagogue, church, and a mosque. 3 separate structures linked by a single garden with a visitor center underneath it. It's situated on Staten Island, which is a little bit like the Mall of Washington. It's the sort of center of Abu Dhabi and reflective of all of the most important symbols of state of the UAE. So the fact that they've chosen to put this beautiful symbol of religious tolerance and the family, so to speak, of nations at the center of their sort of capital, their national capital, is a powerful, powerful expression of their value system. It's going to be ready by the summer of 2022. You can Google it and see the beautiful design that was done by Sir John Adaj, the very famous Nigerian architect. And it's just a thing of profound beauty. The synagogue will be 250 square meters. Don't know what that is in feet, forgive me, and will accommodate 800 people. So it's a really, really significant space. There's not too many Jews in Abu Dhabi, but I believe that the Abrahamic family house will be very, very attractive of Jews that might want to live there. It includes a mikveh, accommodation for a rabbi and a chazan, etc. So it's the most amazing structure. In terms of our relationships with Muslims, Christians, etc. So one of the joys that I've had as being, about being a religious leader here in the UAE is that the relationship with other religious leaders is really, really strong. And we're all working on this project, the project of creating an Islamic version of tolerance here in the Gulf. And it's a project that we deeply care about. So I've made very, very warm friendships with the leader of the Anglican community, who really became a friend and mentor, the leader of the Sikh community, the evangelicals, the Baha'is, the Catholics, etc. We all sort of formed a group that was supportive, and there was a real collaboration between us that was beautiful. And that was not interfaith work, by the way. We weren't discussing theology. We were just helping each other, and we got immense support from the other religions. There was going to be a book celebrating tolerance that our community was not initially included in. And the editor of that book, this wonderful Reverend Andy Thompson, did not publish the book until we were in it, and I actually get cold shivers even speaking about it. Just beautiful sense of friendship between us. In terms of Emiratis, I've worked quite hard, in fact, to make, over time, of course, to create relationships in government, but also to build friendships with Emirati neighbors and friends. They come to our Friday night table. We talk into the early hours of the morning. They're amazing people. They're curious, well-educated, a deep moral conviction about this friendship with Israel. But we also differ on certain issues, and it's very easy to discuss those and exchange. And I think Rabbi San, our chief rabbi, calls us a family reunion, and that is how it feels. It feels like you are meeting a sort of a long-lost cousin, the sort of second cousin twice removed, and you discover actually that you've got a whole lot of things in common that you really care about, and that the exchange is easy and natural. And for all of you, to this exclusive group, I want to encourage you to come to the UAE and see it for yourself, because it's so reassuring as a Jew to be in a situation, Jessica's nodding her head, where you're surrounded by Muslims wearing abayas and kandura, and they're at the mall with you, and they're going to watch Star Wars with you, and they're going to the toy shop and buying the same things that you're buying for your kids. And there's just an amazing sense of ease about that, which you don't get in every country, and it's a beautiful experience.
Thank you for sharing that. That's an incredible message, and fingers crossed that Entwine will be there fairly soon when we can travel again. It's our dream to be able to visit your community as well. I guess the last question for both of you, Ross, you kind of just did this, but if you'd like to just share a message with our audience, especially during this time of the high holidays, what lessons do you want us to walk away with that we can learn from your community?
Look, we've just come out of Rosh Hashanah, which commemorates the birth of human beings, Adam and Eve, the parents that we all have. And, the profound conviction that we have as the UAE Jewish community, the Jews of the UAE, is that there's much more that we have in common, that binds us, than that we have that's different. And that's always got to be the starting point. You've always got to start with what you have in common and have a deep conviction about that and seek that. Once you've found that and once you've established it, you can then talk, you can disagree occasionally, but there's a bedrock of commonality and mutual respect and recognition. And I'm hoping that that's what the Jewish Council will have as its core ethos, and that what our community will come to represent for the Jewish world is a very, very positive and optimistic narrative about the ability of Jews, Muslims, Christians, and people that are all very different to come together, and not in a facile way, but really, really working hard to see each other, to recognize each other, and then be able to discuss the things that also are different about us. So that's what I hope we come to represent in the Jewish world, and I'm very optimistic about our future here.
Incredible. Thank you. And Jess, do you want to leave us with a quick word as well?
Sure. And I absolutely agree with everything that Ross has said. And I think his lessons from earlier were also really strong. I think what's powerful for me is taking ownership over your Jewish identity or your Judaism or whatever it means to you. I think, one of the big lessons I learned from the community, and I think it's really relevant for all of us today, is we're figuring out how do we do the holidays differently than we've probably done them before, or without being in synagogue or zooming in or figuring out what it all means to us. And I think, what the members of this community really did early on and continue to do is sort of define for themselves what they want their Jewish community to look like and how to make it inclusive. And I always sort of said this was kind of the community of the future in some ways, because you're getting so many people with these different backgrounds and having to figure it out together. And I think for me, it's what each person that shows up in Dubai and says, okay, I'm Jewish, how do I find the community? What do I want to do? Is really taking ownership for themselves. And I think we all kind of have to do that and create whether it's the community, the Jewish experience, your own Jewish identity, we have to do it for ourselves as well as for the community. And I think, it's so powerful to see each of the members, and they bring to the community something of themselves or their own background, or watching, when I've watched last year, it was wonderful to see both Ashkenazi and Sephardi traditions coming together. At the end, I think it was at the end of Yom Kippur, maybe, that there was a tradition that the Sephardi Jews sort of bring to the service, and seeing that there's space for all of that to happen, I think is really powerful. So I think it's important for us as individuals, no matter where in the world we are, to sort of show up for ourselves and then show up for our community and connect Jewishly in that way, with whatever it means, I suppose.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to both Ross and Jessica, and to Sean, for joining us today. These lessons in inclusivity and respect are really powerful, and ones that I hope our audience can take with us. I just want to share a few ways to stay involved with Entwine moving forward. This Friday, we're doing a special Shabbat experience with One Table, and celebrating the holidays together. So I hope that you'll join us there. And also, for any Russian-speaking Jews on the call, we have a trip coming up to Ukraine, and you can learn more about that experience and more on our website. And lastly, I would love to hear from all of you. We're going to be sending an email with links to answer more of your questions that came in, and other ways to connect with the Jewish community in Dubai. And please respond to that email so that we can set up a coffee date. I'd love to hear what you want to see from our Entwine exclusives, and gather any feedback from you. So thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next month on our Entwine exclusive. Cool. Thank you, Ross and Jess. This was wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night, Ross.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.